terrifying historical events that sound fake but actually happened. In 1916, Russian soldiers defending a Soviet's fortress were gassed with chlorine that formed hydrochloric acid in their lungs, causing severe chemical burns as they coughed up pieces of lung tissue. The Germans assumed everyone was dead and charged forward to claim their victory. Then something impossible happened. The dead began to rise. Wrapped in blood-soaked cloth, faces melting from chemical burns, these walking corpses stumbled from their trenches and advanced toward the horrified German army. Today we examine this attack of the dead men, alongside H.H. Holmes's murder castle, the unknown woman of the scene who became the face of CPR training, and the Renaissance syphilis outbreak that ate faces. What you're about to hear sounds like something from a horror movie, but every word is documented history. These events reveal how reality can be more terrifying than fiction. The murder castle's hidden architect. But before we witness that impossible battle, we need to travel back to Chicago in 1891, where a different kind of horror was taking shape. Dr. Henry Howard Holmes had just purchased a lot at the corner of South Wallace and West 63rd Street. He told the neighborhood he planned to build a hotel in time for the 1893 World's Fair. What he actually constructed would become known as America's first murder castle. Holmes fired his construction crews with disturbing frequency. Contractors would work for weeks, then suddenly receive termination notices and final payments. New teams would arrive, only to find themselves building additions to work they couldn't understand. Architects lasted even shorter periods. Some quit after reviewing Holmes's bizarre floor plans. Others were dismissed the moment they began asking questions about the building's strange specifications. This constant rotation wasn't incompetence or financial trouble. Holmes deliberately kept any single person from understanding the building's complete design. The completed structure defied logical architecture. The first floor housed legitimate businesses, including Holmes's pharmacy and various shops rented to unsuspecting merchants. But contemporary reports and later sensational press accounts described the upper floors as containing soundproof rooms with no windows that could only be locked from the outside, secret passages connecting guest rooms to Holmes's private chambers, and facilities allegedly used to dispose of bodies. Investigators later found evidence of chemical equipment and instruments tied to dismemberment, though some specific features were likely exaggerated by the press. Holmes had designed what reports described as a kiln and disposal system. Chutes built into the walls could allegedly transport corpses directly from guest rooms to the basement. Some rooms contained trapdoors that dropped victims into the basement, where Holmes had constructed what appeared to be a torture chamber. The basement also housed Holmes's bone articulation equipment. His medical training had taught him the precise techniques for cleaning skeletons and preparing them for sale to medical schools across the country. Holmes realized early that death could be profitable in multiple ways. The 1893 Chicago World's Fair brought 6 months of perfect hunting conditions. Holmes advertised his hotel as affordable lodging for female visitors traveling alone to the exposition. He specifically targeted wealthy women who had traveled long distances to attend the fair. These victims were unlikely to be missed quickly, and their families would assume they were still enjoying their Chicago vacation. Holmes employed psychological manipulation with surgical precision, presenting himself as a successful doctor and businessman, using his medical credentials to establish trust with potential victims. The hotel's guests often commented on strange sounds during the night. Muffled screams echoed through the walls. Footsteps could be heard in rooms that were supposedly empty. Gas odors occasionally seeped under doors, but Holmes always provided reasonable explanations. Construction work caused the noises. Gas leaks were being repaired. Guests were instructed to keep their windows closed for their own safety. After Holmes's arrest in 1894 for insurance fraud, investigators began mapping the building's true layout. They discovered rooms where the walls were scorched from fire. They found scratches on the inside of chambers where victims had clawed at the walls trying to escape. Bloodstains covered floors throughout the upper levels despite Holmes's attempts to clean them. The basement revealed surgical instruments designed for dismembering human bodies, chemical equipment for flesh removal and bone preparation, and shipping crates with addressed labels for medical schools in several states. Determining Holmes's exact victim count proved impossible. Holmes later confessed to over 200 killings, but investigators and historians find hard evidence for a much smaller number. Only a handful are firmly substantiated through physical evidence and documented disappearances. Many victims had traveled to Chicago alone, making it difficult for investigators to identify missing persons. The acid baths had eliminated most physical evidence, and Holmes destroyed guest registers and financial records before his arrest. Holmes's systematic approach to murder established a template that future serial killers would follow. He demonstrated how careful planning could enable mass murder while avoiding detection. He showed that psychological manipulation could be more effective than physical force for controlling victims. The murder castle operated for less than 2 years, but its impact on criminal methodology lasted much longer. Holmes had transformed killing from a crime of passion into an industrial process. It's important to note that the murder castle mythology was significantly amplified by newspapers of the time, which sensationalized many details to sell papers. While Holmes was undoubtedly a killer who used his building for sinister purposes, some of the more elaborate descriptions of his methods may have been embellished by contemporary media hungry for shocking stories. Yet even accounting for sensationalism, the documented evidence reveals a mind capable of extraordinary calculation and cruelty. Holmes had created something unprecedented in American crime, a purpose-built facility for systematic murder that would haunt the public imagination for generations. But as horrifying as his calculated murders were, they pale beside what happened when soldiers faced a different kind of death entirely, one that came not from human malice but from the poisoned air itself. When the dead refused to die, the Osowicz fortress stood like a concrete monument to human stubbornness on the border between Russia and Germany. Built by the Russian Empire as their last line of defense, this massive structure had already proven its worth by September 19th. German forces had launched 2 major assaults against the fortress, losing roughly 6,000 men in their first attempt, while the Russians suffered only 139 casualties. The second assault ended in similar failure, with German artillery barrages proving ineffective against the fortress's thick walls and strategic positioning. By August 1915, German commanders had grown desperate. Their traditional military tactics had failed repeatedly against Soviets' defenses. The fortress controlled a critical railway line, and its continued resistance was disrupting German supply operations across the entire Eastern Front. German High Command decided to deploy a weapon that would guarantee success: chlorine gas. The Germans assembled a specialized gas attack unit and transported dozens of chlorine canisters to positions surrounding the fortress. Chlorine gas appeared as a dense yellow-green cloud when released, and German commanders believed it would clear the fortress of defenders within minutes. They waited for perfect wind conditions that would carry the gas directly into the Russian positions while keeping their own troops safe from exposure. Inside Osowicz, roughly 900 Russian soldiers continued their daily routines of maintenance and guard duty. These men had survived months of artillery bombardment and infantry assaults. They had watched their comrades die defending these walls. They understood that their position was nearly hopeless, but they remained committed to holding their ground for as long as possible. None of them understood what was coming. When chlorine gas enters the human respiratory system, it reacts with moisture in the lungs and throat to form hydrochloric acid. This acid burns lung tissue from the inside, causing severe chemical burns throughout the respiratory tract. Victims experience immediate pain as their lung tissue begins dissolving. The acid destroys the delicate structures that allow oxygen to enter the bloodstream. Early on August 6, 1915, German forces released their chlorine gas canisters. The yellow-green cloud drifted across the battlefield toward the Russian positions. Russian soldiers had no proper gas masks or protective equipment. They desperately tried to shield themselves by soaking rags in urine and covering their faces, believing the ammonia might neutralize the gas. This improvised protection proved completely useless against chlorine's chemical properties. The gas cloud enveloped the fortress. Russian soldiers began choking immediately as the chlorine reacted with moisture in their respiratory systems. The acid formed inside their lungs caused excruciating pain. Men fell to their knees, gasping for air that only brought more poison into their bodies. The chemical burns spread throughout their respiratory tracts. Blisters formed on exposed skin where the gas made contact. German forces waited for the gas to clear, then advanced confidently toward the fortress. They expected to find only corpses or unconscious enemies who could be easily captured. Their officers had assured them that no human being could survive direct exposure to concentrated chlorine gas. The German soldiers moved forward, anticipating an easy victory after months of costly defeats. What happened next defied every expectation. As German troops approached the fortress walls, figures began emerging from the gas-covered Russian positions. These were not fresh reinforcements or soldiers who had somehow avoided the gas attack. These were the same Russian defenders who had been directly exposed to the chlorine cloud minutes earlier. The sight that greeted the advancing German army was horrifying beyond imagination. Russian soldiers stumbled forward with severe chemical burns covering their faces and hands. They coughed violently, spitting up pieces of their own lung tissue that had been dissolved by the hydrochloric acid, along with blood that poured from their mouths and noses. Their eyes streamed tears mixed with chemical burns, yet these walking corpses still carried their rifles. The psychological impact on German troops was immediate and devastating. These soldiers had been told they would face no resistance after the gas attack. Instead, they encountered what appeared to be dead men who refused to stay dead. The Russian defenders moved with their bodies clearly destroyed by the chemical weapon, but their determination to fight somehow intact despite their horrific injuries. German soldiers began retreating before any shots were fired. The sight of these burned, bleeding Russians advancing with their weapons ready broke the morale of an entire German assault force. Officers shouted orders to hold position, but their men were already fleeing in terror. Nothing in their military training had prepared them for combat against enemies who appeared to be already dead. The surviving Russian defenders, despite tissue damage throughout their respiratory systems, managed to mount one final counterattack. They fired their rifles at the retreating Germans. They operated their artillery pieces. They defended their positions exactly as they had done during previous assaults, except now they were doing it while their bodies were literally dissolving from chemical poisoning. This impossible last stand lasted only minutes. The Russian soldiers had used every remaining bit of their strength to drive back the German assault one final time. Within hours of their final defense, most of the gas-exposed defenders died from their injuries. The chlorine poisoning had caused irreversible damage to their respiratory systems. Their lungs could no longer process oxygen effectively. One by one, these heroes finally succumbed to the chemical weapon that should have killed them instantly. This engagement became known in military history as the Attack of the Dead Men. The name captured both the horrific appearance of the Russian defenders and their supernatural determination to continue fighting despite fatal injuries. The episode changed how commanders thought about chemical weapons, revealing that their psychological effects could be as unpredictable as their physical ones. Sometimes the sight alone could break an army's morale more completely than any conventional weapon. But while these soldiers were writing their names in history through sheer force of will, death was taking a very different form elsewhere in Europe, one that would smile serenely for generations to come, the smiling death that haunts us all. In the late 1880s, workers pulling bodies from the Seine River made a discovery that would puzzle investigators and captivate an entire city. They had found the corpse of a young woman, perhaps 16 years old, floating face up in the dark waters. What made this discovery unusual was not the location or circumstances, but the expression frozen on her face. Even in death, she wore a serene, almost peaceful smile. Medical examiners found no signs of assault, no defensive wounds, no indication that anyone else had been involved in her death. They judged drowning probable and suggested suicide as the most likely cause, but her face told a different story than most suicide victims. Instead of the anguish or despair typically seen in such cases, this unknown woman looked almost content, as if she had found some kind of peace in her final moments. Paris morgues in the 1880s operated under a system that seems grotesque by modern standards. Unclaimed bodies were displayed behind glass windows for public viewing, allowing citizens to identify missing relatives or friends, turning the morgue into what locals called the only free theater in Paris. The unknown woman from the Seine drew particular attention from these visitors. Her youth made the mystery more compelling. Her beauty, preserved by the cold water and her recent death, made her appear almost alive despite being clearly deceased. The combination of youth, beauty, and mystery proved irresistible to Parisians hungry for stories that would break the monotony of their daily lives. One morgue attendant became particularly fascinated with the unknown woman's face. He spent hours studying her expression. trying to understand what could have produced such serenity in someone who had chosen to end her own life. The attendant decided that this face was too remarkable to disappear forever into an unmarked grave. He made the decision to preserve her likeness using the established technique of death mask creation. Creating death masks involved covering the deceased person's face with plaster, allowing it to harden, then carefully removing the mold to create a permanent replica. This process captured every detail of facial features, from the curve of lips to the shape of closed eyelids. The morgue attendant worked carefully to ensure that the unknown woman's peaceful expression would be preserved exactly as he had observed it. The resulting plaster mask captured not just her physical features, but somehow seemed to preserve the mystery of her final smile. The death mask became an immediate sensation among Parisians. Copies were manufactured and sold throughout the city. What had begun as one morgue worker's attempt to preserve an interesting face became a commercial phenomenon. Upper-class Parisians began purchasing copies of the mask to display in their homes. The unknown woman's face became a fashionable decoration, hanging on walls throughout elegant Parisian apartments and houses. This trend spread beyond Paris to other European cities. The mask appeared in homes across France, Germany, and beyond. What struck people as particularly fascinating was the expression itself. Unlike most death masks, which typically showed the slack features of deceased individuals, this woman's face seemed to convey emotion even in death. Her slight smile suggested secrets, mysteries, perhaps even a kind of wisdom that came from accepting her fate. Artists and writers became obsessed with the unknown woman's story. They created paintings inspired by her face, wrote poems about her mysterious death, and crafted elaborate theories about who she might have been. Some imagined she was a failed actress who chose death over poverty. Others believed she was a young woman from a wealthy family who had fallen in love with someone inappropriate and chose suicide over shame. The lack of any real information about her identity allowed people to project their own romantic fantasies onto her story. The woman's face inspired a generation of artists who saw in her expression a symbol of acceptance and control over death rather than fear or despair. Her image appeared in paintings, sculptures, and literary works throughout the late 19th and early 20th centuries. She became known as l'inconnue de la Seine, the unknown woman of the Seine, and her face became one of the most recognizable images in European art and culture. But the most unexpected chapter in this unknown woman's story began decades later. In 1960, a Norwegian toy maker named Asmund Lerdahl was developing a training mannequin for teaching cardiopulmonary resuscitation. He needed a face for his training dummy, something that would be pleasant to look at but not so distinctive that it would distract students from learning proper CPR techniques. Lerdahl chose the face of l'inconnue de la Seine as the model for his creation. The CPR training doll, known as Resuscian, became the standard teaching tool for emergency medical training worldwide. Since 1960, millions of people have learned mouth-to-mouth resuscitation by practicing on a doll modeled after the unknown woman from the Seine. Students in medical schools, nursing programs, and first aid classes have unknowingly placed their lips against the face of a suicide victim from 19th century Paris. This connection creates an eerie circle of life and death that spans more than a century. The woman who chose to end her life in the Seine River has become the face that teaches others how to save lives. Every time someone performs CPR on Resuscian, they are literally breathing life into the image of someone who chose death. A face that likely ended its own life now trains millions to save lives. Yet this peaceful death would soon seem merciful compared to the horror that was already spreading across Renaissance Europe, where death wore a very different face entirely. The Renaissance plague that ate faces. In 1494, French King Charles VIII led his army into Naples to claim the Italian throne. His soldiers came from across Europe: French knights, Swiss mercenaries, Spanish fighters, and Italian allies. After their successful conquest, these men celebrated in the taverns and brothels of Naples with wine flowing freely and local women eager to entertain the victorious army. This mass interaction of soldiers and locals helped spread what contemporaries called the French disease, now widely identified as syphilis. This celebration created perfect conditions for disease transmission. Thousands of soldiers from different regions gathered in one city, sharing close quarters and intimate contact with the local population. The mixing of populations that had been geographically isolated for generations allowed pathogens to jump between groups that had no immunity to foreign diseases. What emerged from this mixing would become one of history's most horrifying plagues. Within weeks of the celebration, soldiers began developing unusual symptoms. The disease started with painful ulcers on the genitals, but this was only the beginning. Unlike other known ailments, this new plague refused to remain localized. After the initial sores appeared, victims developed high fevers that left them bedridden for days. Their bodies erupted in rashes that spread across their skin like wildfire. Muscle pain racked their bodies, making movement excruciating. But the early symptoms were nothing compared to what followed. As the disease progressed into its secondary and tertiary stages, the real horror began. The so-called French disease produced gummatous lesions and destructive ulcers that penetrated deep into tissue. These weren't surface infections that could heal with time. The lesions burrowed deeper into flesh, creating craters that exposed the skeletal structure underneath. Secondary manifestations caused painful sores to erupt across victims' entire bodies, while tertiary symptoms led to severe tissue destruction. The disease attacked its victims systematically. Flesh began rotting while people were still alive. Chunks of decaying tissue would fall off bodies as people walked through the streets. The stench of rotting flesh surrounded the afflicted, announcing their presence before they could be seen. Arms and legs developed open wounds that never healed, constantly weeping pus and blood that stained clothing and left trails on the ground. The facial disfigurement was perhaps the most horrifying aspect of this plague. Tertiary syphilis targeted the soft tissues of the face with particular cruelty, producing gummatous lesions that destroyed normal features. Noses simply rotted away, leaving gaping holes where normal features had been. Lips dissolved, exposing teeth and gums in permanent ghoulish grins. Eyes became infected and swollen until they burst, leaving empty sockets that oozed continuously. Ears crumbled and fell off, leaving ragged stumps on the sides of heads. Despite this massive tissue destruction, the disease rarely killed quickly. Victims survived for months or years with their faces eaten away and their bodies covered in festering sores. They walked through European cities as living corpses, their humanity stripped away by a disease that seemed designed to inflict maximum suffering while keeping its victims alive to endure every moment of their deterioration. This Renaissance strain of syphilis was far more aggressive than the modern version of the disease. Today's syphilis progresses slowly and can be easily treated with antibiotics. The Renaissance variant moved quickly through its stages and caused much more severe tissue damage. Modern syphilis rarely causes the extreme facial disfigurement that characterized the 15th century outbreak. Something about this particular strain made it exceptionally virulent and destructive. As Charles VIII's army disbanded and soldiers returned to their home countries, they carried the disease across the known world. French soldiers brought it back to France, where it spread through the population within months. Spanish mercenaries transported it to Spain, and from there to the New World colonies. Swiss fighters carried it back to German territories. Italian soldiers spread it throughout the Italian peninsula. By 1520, the disease had reached Africa and Asia, demonstrating how rapidly contagion could move with early modern travel and warfare. European cities became filled with walking nightmares. Imagine trying to conduct normal daily business while surrounded by people whose faces had been eaten away by disease. Market squares hosted vendors whose noses had rotted off. Churches welcomed worshippers whose lips had dissolved. Taverns served customers who lacked eyes. The visual impact of this epidemic was as psychologically damaging as it was physically destructive. The social fabric of European society began tearing under the strain of widespread disfigurement. Families abandoned members who showed symptoms of the disease. Marriage contracts included clauses about what would happen if either party developed the plague. Entire neighborhoods were avoided if too many residents showed signs of infection. The normal social interactions that held communities together became dangerous because close contact could spread the disease. Religious leaders proclaimed that this plague was divine punishment for moral corruption, particularly sexual immorality. The fact that the disease often began with genital symptoms seemed to confirm that God was punishing humanity for lustful behavior. This interpretation added shame to the physical suffering, making victims social outcasts even among their own families. Artists and writers began incorporating images of facial disfigurement into their work. Paintings from this period show an obsession with decay and bodily corruption that reflected the reality of daily life in plague-affected areas. Literature became darker and more focused on physical suffering and moral punishment. The cultural production of an entire generation was shaped by witnessing the slow decay of human bodies. The epidemic changed social attitudes toward sexuality and fears of contagion, reinforced religious explanations for moral punishment, and influenced art and literature of the era. This plague created lasting cultural trauma that influenced European society long after the disease itself had evolved into a less virulent form. But while this Renaissance horror consumed faces across Europe, another kind of destruction was taking shape in America, one that would span generations and destroy lives in ways that physical disease never could. The president's bodyguard who became a killer. On the evening of April 14, 1865, Major Henry Rathbone sat in the presidential box at Ford's Theater watching a comedy called Our American Cousin. He was there as both guest and protector, accompanying President Lincoln and Mary Todd Lincoln along with his fiancée Clara Harris. Rathbone was a decorated Civil War officer, a man accustomed to danger and trained to react quickly in crisis situations. The theater was packed with Washington society celebrating the end of the Civil War. Lincoln appeared relaxed, laughing at the play's humor and enjoying what seemed like the first peaceful evening he had experienced in years. Rathbone sat behind the president, positioned where he could observe both the stage and the theater entrance. His military training kept him alert even during the entertainment, though nothing in the evening's atmosphere suggested any danger. At approximately 10:15 p.m., John Wilkes Booth entered the presidential box. The actor moved quietly, timing his approach during a particularly loud scene when audience laughter would mask any sound. Rathbone noticed Booth's presence just as the assassin raised his Derringer pistol toward Lincoln's head. The major sprang from his seat, but Booth fired before Rathbone could reach him. The gunshot created immediate chaos in the small box. Mary Lincoln screamed. Theater patrons began shouting from the audience below. Smoke from the black powder pistol filled the enclosed space. Through this confusion, Rathbone launched himself at Booth, grappling with the assassin who was attempting to escape over the box's railing to the stage below. Booth drew a large knife during their struggle and slashed deeply into Rathbone's left arm, cutting through muscle and severing an artery. Blood poured from the wound, but Rathbone continued fighting, trying to prevent Booth's escape. The assassin broke free and leaped from the box, landing awkwardly on the stage and breaking his leg. Despite his injury, Booth limped across the stage, shouting his famous words before disappearing into the wings. Rathbone collapsed from blood loss as doctors in the audience rushed to assist both him and the mortally wounded president. The major's injury required immediate attention to prevent him from bleeding to death, but his physical wound would heal within weeks. What followed would prove far more devastating than any knife cut. The guilt began immediately and consumed Rathbone's thoughts. He replayed the assassination constantly in his mind, analyzing every moment and convincing himself that he could have prevented Lincoln's death if he had reacted faster or positioned himself differently. He believed his failure had changed the course of American history. This responsibility crushed his spirit and began eroding his mental stability. After recovering from his physical injuries, Rathbone resigned from the military and married Clara Harris, attempting to establish a normal civilian existence. But the trauma from Ford's Theater followed him everywhere. Friends and family noticed his increasing agitation and tendency toward violent outbursts. He began experiencing paranoid thoughts, believing that people blamed him for Lincoln's death and were plotting against him. President Arthur appointed Rathbone to a consular position in Germany, hoping that distance from America would help him recover from his trauma. The family moved to Europe, but the change of location provided no relief. Rathbone's mental condition continued deteriorating. He became increasingly suspicious of his wife and children, accusing them of conspiracies against him. His violent tendencies grew more frequent and severe. Clara Rathbone watched her husband's mind disintegrate over the years following their move to Germany. The man who had once been a respected military officer became unpredictable and dangerous. He would fly into rages without warning, then claim to hear voices whispering to him from inside the walls of their home. His paranoid delusions focused increasingly on his family members, whom he began to see as threats rather than loved ones. The breaking point arrived on December 23, 1883, nearly 19 years after that fatal night at Ford's Theater. Rathbone's mental state collapsed completely during what should have been a peaceful Christmas Eve preparation. In a fit of madness, he attacked his own children, the same children Clara had been trying to protect from his increasing violence for years. Clara Harris Rathbone heard the children screaming and rushed to intervene. She found her husband in a complete psychotic break, wielding a knife and threatening their terrified children. Clara positioned herself between Rathbone and the children, trying to calm him and protect them from his attack. Her intervention triggered an even more violent response from her husband. Rathbone fatally shot Clara, then stabbed her repeatedly as she fell. The woman who had sat in the presidential box on that terrible night in 1865 died trying to save her children from the man who had once tried to save a president. After murdering his wife, Rathbone turned the knife on himself, stabbing his own chest multiple times in a failed suicide attempt. Police found Rathbone covered in blood, claiming he could hear voices whispering to him from within the walls of his home. These auditory hallucinations had been tormenting him for years and had finally driven him to murder. He survived his self-inflicted wounds and was arrested for Clara's murder. Court doctors declared him legally insane during his trial. Rathbone spent the remaining 28 years of his life in an asylum, never recovering from the mental breakdown that began in Ford's Theater. The trauma from failing to prevent Lincoln's assassination had slowly consumed his mind, destroying his marriage, his family, and ultimately his wife's life. He died in 1911, 46 years after that single night of violence had begun his descent into madness. But while Rathbone was trapped in his asylum, wrestling with voices that existed only in his deteriorating mind, other mysteries were unfolding across the world that would prove even more baffling than the workings of a broken human psyche. The ship that sailed into oblivion. In October 1955, the MV Joyita prepared to depart from Apia, Samoa, carrying 25 souls on what should have been a simple 2-day voyage to the Tokelau Islands. The 70-foot merchant vessel had made this journey many times before, covering the 270 miles of open ocean that separated Samoa from its destination. Captain Thomas Henry Miller commanded a crew of 9 experienced sailors, while 16 passengers settled in for what they expected to be a routine trip across familiar waters. Among the passengers were a government official traveling on administrative business and a doctor making his regular rounds to provide medical care in the remote island chain. Families with children occupied the passenger quarters, looking forward to visiting relatives or conducting business in the Tokelau Islands. The ship's cargo hold contained lumber, medical supplies, and various goods needed by the island communities. Everything about this voyage appeared completely ordinary, the kind of inter-island transportation that kept Pacific communities connected to the outside world. The Joyita departed Samoa on October 3, 1955, under clear skies with favorable weather conditions. Radio contact with the vessel remained normal during the first hours of the journey. The ship maintained its expected course and speed, with no indication of mechanical problems or navigation difficulties. Captain Miller had decades of experience sailing these waters and knew every current, reef, and weather pattern that could affect his vessel's progress. October 5 arrived without any sign of the Joyita reaching its destination. Port authorities in the Tokelau Islands waited through the morning, then the afternoon, expecting to see the familiar silhouette appearing on the horizon. When evening came with no arrival, concern began to grow among officials and family members who were expecting passengers. The Joyita had never been significantly late on this route. Search and rescue operations began immediately, with multiple vessels and aircraft scanning thousands of square miles of Pacific Ocean. Rescue teams followed the Joyita's planned route, then expanded their search pattern to cover areas where strong currents might have carried a disabled vessel. Radio operators broadcast continuous signals, hoping to receive any distress call from the missing ship. Days passed with no trace of the Joyita or anyone who had been aboard. 5 weeks after the disappearance, a merchant vessel spotted something unusual drifting in waters approximately 600 miles from where the Joyita should have been traveling. The discovery location was far off the planned route, in an area that search teams had not thoroughly covered. As the rescue vessel approached, crew members could see that they had found the missing Joyita, but the ship condition immediately raised more questions than it answered. The Joyfida floated partially submerged, listing heavily to one side and clearly taking on water. The vessel remained afloat, but barely, riding so low that waves frequently washed over the deck. No signs of life were visible aboard the derelict ship. No one responded to radio calls or horn signals from the approaching rescue vessel. The Joyfida had become a ghost ship, abandoned and drifting with no indication of what had happened to the 25 people who should have been aboard. Rescue teams boarded the partially flooded vessel and began documenting what they found. The radio equipment had been damaged, explaining why no distress calls had been received. The ship's engines were not functioning, leaving the vessel unable to maintain course or speed. Hull damage was evident, with significant flooding in the lower compartments that explained why the Joyita was riding so low in the water. These mechanical failures created a dangerous situation that would have required the crew to take emergency action. The most disturbing discovery was what was missing from the abandoned vessel. All lifeboats had been removed, suggesting that passengers and crew had time to organize an evacuation. Personal belongings remained scattered throughout the passenger quarters, but no people could be found anywhere aboard the ship. The cargo hold was partially empty, with some lumber and supplies missing along with the human occupants. Most significantly, the ship's logbooks had vanished, eliminating any written record of what had occurred during the final hours before abandonment. Evidence suggested that the evacuation had been conducted in an orderly manner rather than a panicked flight from immediate danger. Lifeboats had been properly lowered rather than cut away in desperation. Some supplies appeared to have been taken, indicating preparation for survival at sea. The absence of bodies or blood suggested that no violence had occurred aboard the vessel itself. Whatever had forced 25 people to abandon the Joyita, they had apparently succeeded in getting away from the ship alive. The mystery deepened as investigators tried to trace what had happened after the abandonment. No lifeboats were ever found. No survivors reached any Pacific island. No bodies washed ashore anywhere in the region. 25 human beings had simply vanished into the vast Pacific Ocean, leaving behind only an empty ship and unanswered questions that persist nearly 70 years later. The official investigation concluded that hull damage from an unknown collision had caused flooding, while engine failure and damaged radio equipment left the crew unable to call for help or maintain course. The missing lifeboat supported the theory that everyone aboard had abandoned ship in an organized evacuation, but this explanation only deepened the central mystery: what happened to 25 people after they left the Joyita? The Pacific Ocean had swallowed these souls without leaving any trace, creating another chapter in the long catalog of human disappearances that defy explanation. But while the Joyita's passengers vanished into the vastness of the sea, other disappearances were taking place in more confined spaces, where the truth would prove far more sinister than any ocean mystery: the doctor who collected human heads. In London during 1910, Dr. Holly Harvey Crippen appeared to be everything Victorian society admired in a gentleman. He wore respectable suits, maintained a medical practice, and spoke with a soft American accent that many London residents found charming. Neighbors saw him as a quiet, devoted husband who worked long hours to support his more flamboyant wife. This carefully constructed image concealed a mind that was calculating murder with the same precision he applied to medical procedures. Crippen had married Cora Turner, who performed in London music halls under the stage name Belle Elmore. She possessed ambitions that far exceeded her modest talent, dreams of theatrical success that required expensive gowns, jewelry, and entertainment that drained the household finances. Cora dominated their marriage through constant demands for money and attention, treating her mild-mannered husband like a servant whose only purpose was funding her theatrical fantasies. She ridiculed Crippen in front of their friends, mocking his appearance and his inability to provide the luxurious lifestyle she believed she deserved. The marriage became increasingly toxic as Cora's spending habits pushed them toward financial ruin while her career prospects continued declining. She refused to accept that her dreams of stardom were unrealistic, instead blaming Crippen for not earning enough money to support her ambitions properly. Their home became a battlefield where Cora's verbal attacks grew more vicious and Crippen's resentment built steadily behind his submissive exterior. Friends noticed the tension between them but assumed this was simply how their relationship functioned. Crippen found solace in his relationship with Ethel LeNave. his secretary at the medical office where he worked. Ethel was everything Cora was not: quiet, supportive, and genuinely affectionate toward the doctor who had shown her kindness and attention. Their affair developed slowly, built on shared conversations and mutual respect rather than the financial calculations that had motivated Crippen's marriage to Cora. Ethel represented the peaceful domestic life that Crippen had always wanted but never experienced with his demanding wife. The affair created an impossible situation for Crippen, who found himself supporting two women while earning a modest income from his medical practice. Cora's spending continued unchecked, while Ethel's presence in his life made returning home each evening increasingly unbearable. Divorce would have been financially devastating and socially scandalous, destroying both his medical practice and his reputation in London society. Crippen began considering more permanent solutions to his domestic problems. On February 1, 1910, Cora Crippen attended a dinner party with friends from the music hall community. She appeared in good spirits, discussing upcoming performances and social events with her usual enthusiasm. That evening was the last time anyone outside the Crippen household would see her alive. The next day, Crippen told inquiring friends that Cora had received urgent news about a sick relative in America and had departed immediately for an extended visit. As weeks passed without any letters from Cora, her friends began expressing concern about her prolonged silence. Crippen provided increasingly elaborate explanations for his wife's absence, claiming that her relative's condition had worsened and required her extended care. When friends asked for Cora's American address so they could write to her directly, Crippen made excuses about postal difficulties and promised to forward their messages. These evasive responses began raising suspicions among people who knew Cora would never remain silent for such an extended period. The situation became more suspicious when friends noticed that Ethel Leonid had begun wearing Cora's jewelry and clothing to social events. Crippen explained that Cora had left these items behind and asked him to give them to Ethel rather than letting them sit unused. This explanation struck many people as highly unlikely given Cora's attachment to her expensive possessions and her generally possessive nature. Friends began discussing their concerns privately, wondering if something more sinister had happened to the missing woman. Police reluctantly agreed to investigate after Cora's friends continued pressing them about her disappearance. The initial investigation was cursory, with officers finding no obvious signs of violence or struggle in the Crippen home. Crippen answered their questions calmly and provided reasonable explanations for his wife's absence. The investigators lacked sophisticated forensic techniques and examined the house superficially, concluding that no crime had been committed. This initial police visit terrified Crippen, who realized that official suspicion was now focused on him. He made the critical error of fleeing London with Ethel, abandoning his medical practice and disappearing without explanation. This sudden flight transformed what had been mere suspicion into certainty that Crippen had committed a serious crime. Police returned to search his house more thoroughly, this time focusing on areas they had previously ignored. The second search revealed a horrifying truth buried beneath the cellar floor. Investigators found human remains that had been carefully dismembered and buried in quicklime, an attempt to accelerate decomposition and eliminate evidence. The condition of the remains made identification difficult, but forensic examination revealed crucial evidence that would prove the victim's identity. A piece of skin bore a distinctive surgical scar that matched medical records for an abdominal operation Cora had undergone years earlier. This forensic breakthrough provided the definitive proof needed to charge Crippen with murder. The surgical scar was so distinctive that medical experts could testify with certainty about the victim's identity. Crippen and Ethel had boarded a ship bound for Canada, disguising themselves as father and son to avoid detection. Ethel had cut her hair short and dressed in men's clothing, while Crippen had shaved his distinctive mustache and altered his appearance. Their escape attempt failed when the ship's captain recognized them from newspaper descriptions and alerted authorities. Crippen was captured, tried, and ultimately executed for his crime. The case became notorious throughout Britain, demonstrating how a respectable facade could conceal the most calculated evil. But while London was captivating itself with this domestic murder, an entirely different kind of madness was about to consume an entire community in ways that defied all medical understanding. The town that danced itself to death. In July 1518, the cobblestone streets of Strasbourg witnessed something that defied all rational explanation. A woman named Frau Trophia stepped out of her house and began dancing in the public square. At first, passers-by assumed she was celebrating some private joy or perhaps performing for coins. Her movements were energetic and continuous, drawing curious crowds who watched with amusement as she spun and stepped to music only she could hear. Hours passed, then a full day, and Frau Trophia continued her relentless dancing. Her feet began bleeding through her leather shoes, but she showed no signs of stopping or even slowing her frenzied movements. Spectators' amusement turned to concern as they realized this woman was not performing by choice. Something had seized control of her body, forcing her to dance without rest, without food, without any apparent ability to stop the endless motion that was destroying her physically. The bleeding woman's condition attracted more attention as word spread through Strasbourg's narrow streets. Citizens gathered around her, trying to understand what force could compel a human being to dance until her feet bled and her body swayed from exhaustion. Some attempted to restrain her, but Frau Trophia fought against their efforts with surprising strength, as if some external power demanded that she continue moving. Her eyes showed awareness of her situation, but her body refused to obey her conscious will to rest. Within days, the impossible became even more horrifying. Other residents of Strasbourg began displaying identical symptoms, their bodies seized by the same compulsive dancing that had claimed Frau Trophia. Dozens of people found themselves unable to control their movements, spinning and stepping in the streets while their families watched in helpless terror. The dancing spread like a contagious disease, jumping from person to person through some mechanism that no one could identify or prevent. The number of afflicted residents grew rapidly from dozens to hundreds. Entire neighborhoods echoed with the sounds of feet pounding against stone streets and the gasps of exhausted dancers who could not stop their tormented movements. Families watched their loved ones dance until their shoes disintegrated and their bare feet left bloody trails on the cobblestones. Children danced alongside adults, their small bodies pushed beyond endurance by whatever force controlled their limbs. Strasbourg's authorities faced a crisis unlike anything in their experience. The city's physicians had no medical explanation for a condition that forced people to dance continuously without rest. Religious leaders debated whether this represented divine punishment or demonic possession. City officials struggled to maintain order as hundreds of residents danced through the streets, unable to work, eat properly, or care for their families. The normal functioning of urban life collapsed under the weight of collective madness. The authorities made a decision that seems incomprehensible today but reflected medieval understanding of medicine and psychology. They concluded that the dancers needed to dance more, not less, to cure their affliction. City officials hired professional musicians and constructed a wooden stage in the public square, believing that organized dancing would somehow purge whatever toxin or evil spirit had infected the population. This response transformed a medical crisis into a public spectacle that encouraged rather than contained the epidemic. The physical toll on the dancers was devastating. Human bodies cannot sustain continuous, vigorous movement for days without rest, food, or proper care. Heart attacks struck down dancers whose cardiovascular systems could no longer support the endless exertion. Strokes felled others as blood pressure and exhaustion overwhelmed their brains. Many simply collapsed from dehydration and physical exhaustion, their bodies finally refusing to continue the deadly dance that had consumed their lives. People literally danced themselves to death on the streets of Strasbourg. Families watched helplessly as their relatives succumbed to heart failure, strokes, and complete physical collapse brought on by days of uncontrollable movement. The city's graveyards began filling with victims of an epidemic that killed through forced exercise rather than disease or violence. Historical records vary on the exact death toll, but estimates range from dozens to hundreds of victims who died from the physical consequences of uncontrollable dancing. Modern medical understanding offers two primary theories for what might have caused this mass affliction. Ergot poisoning from contaminated rye grain could have produced the convulsions and hallucinations that manifested as compulsive dancing. The fungus that grows on rye produces alkaloids with effects similar to modern hallucinogenic drugs, potentially explaining the victim's inability to control their movements and their perception of music that others could not hear. Mass psychogenic illness represents the other leading explanation, where psychological stress triggered physical symptoms that spread through social contagion. The social and economic conditions in early 16th century Strasbourg created perfect circumstances for collective psychological breakdown. Poverty, disease, and religious tension had created a population under extreme stress. When one person's psychological distress manifested as uncontrollable dancing, others may have unconsciously adopted similar symptoms as a way of expressing their own unbearable anxieties. Both theories remain plausible explanations for the 1518 dancing plague, though neither can be definitively proven from historical records. What remains certain is that the event demonstrates how social stress combined with limited medical understanding could transform collective anxiety into lethal physical behavior. The medieval mind understood mental illness poorly, making psychological epidemics more likely to spread unchecked through communities already pushed beyond their breaking point. The dancing plague was finally contained after weeks of death and madness, leaving Strasbourg to bury its victims and attempt to understand what had consumed their city. Yet even this collective horror pales beside situations where individuals face impossible medical crises with only their own knowledge and determination standing between them and certain death. The surgeon who operated on himself. In 1961, Dr. Leonid Rogozov found himself facing exactly such a crisis at Novolazarevskaya, a Soviet research base in Antarctica. The 27-year-old surgeon had volunteered for this assignment, understanding that he would spend months in complete isolation from the outside world. What he could not have anticipated was how this isolation would force him to confront his own mortality in the most extraordinary way possible. Antarctic research stations operate under conditions that most people cannot imagine. Novolazarevskaya was located thousands of miles from the nearest hospital, surrounded by nothing but ice and snow that stretched endlessly in every direction. During the Antarctic winter, temperatures dropped so low that aircraft could not operate safely. Radio communication was limited and unreliable. No rescue missions were possible until the weather improved months later. The research team was completely cut off from civilization, dependent entirely on their own resources and skills to survive until spring. Rogozov served as the station's only medical officer, responsible for treating any injuries or illnesses that affected the research team. He had prepared for this responsibility by studying common medical problems that might arise in isolated conditions. He had stocked the medical station with supplies and equipment necessary for treating routine ailments. But no amount of preparation could have readied him for what happened in April 1961, when he began experiencing abdominal pain, fever, and nausea that clearly indicated appendicitis. The medical reality of Rogozov's situation was stark and terrifying. Appendicitis begins with inflammation of the appendix, a small organ attached to the large intestine. If left untreated, the inflamed appendix will rupture, spilling infected material into the abdominal cavity. This rupture causes peritonitis, a life-threatening infection that spreads throughout the abdomen. Without surgical intervention, peritonitis kills within days as the infection overwhelms the body's ability to fight back. Rogozov understood these medical facts better than anyone at the research station. No evacuation was possible from Novolazarevskaya during the Antarctic winter. Aircraft could not land safely in the extreme cold and wind conditions. Even if a plane could somehow reach the station, Rogozov's condition was deteriorating too rapidly for him to survive the flight to a hospital. His symptoms were growing worse each day, and he could feel his body beginning to succumb to the infection spreading through his abdomen. The choice became brutally simple: attempt to remove his own appendix or die from peritonitis within the week. Rogozov made the unprecedented decision to operate on himself, knowing that no surgeon in history had successfully performed such a procedure. He began preparing for the operation with the same methodical approach he would use for any surgery, except this time he would be both doctor and patient. He selected 2 colleagues to assist him, a meteorologist and a mechanic who had no medical training but could follow basic instructions. These men would have to serve as his surgical team in conditions that violated every principle of modern medical practice. The preparation process required solving problems that no medical school had ever taught. Rogozov set up mirrors around the surgical area to give himself a view of his abdomen during the operation. He sterilized his surgical instruments using the limited sterilization equipment available at the research station. He instructed his assistants on how to pass instruments, hold lights, and monitor his condition during the procedure. He administered local anesthesia to numb the surgical site, knowing that general anesthesia would make self-surgery impossible. The operation began with Rogozov making the initial incision into his own abdomen. Working in a semi-reclined position, he used the mirrors to guide his scalpel through skin, muscle, and tissue toward his infected appendix. The reversed mirror images made every movement more difficult and dangerous. His hands had to move in directions that felt wrong while watching his reflection. The local anesthesia reduced but did not eliminate the pain of cutting into his own body. Nausea and dizziness threatened to overwhelm Rogozov as he worked deeper into his abdominal cavity. The sight of his own blood and internal organs, combined with the physical stress of surgery, pushed his body toward unconsciousness. He fought against these sensations, taking breaks when necessary to rest and regain his strength. His assistants watched helplessly as their colleague battled both his disease and the trauma he was inflicting on himself to cure it. The most critical moment came when Rogozov located his inflamed appendix and began the delicate process of removing it without damaging surrounding organs. Working entirely by feel and mirror image, he had to cut away the infected tissue while avoiding the blood vessels and intestines that surrounded it. His hands trembled from exhaustion and blood loss, but he forced himself to maintain the steady precision that surgery demanded. One mistake could cause internal bleeding or organ damage that would kill him even if he successfully removed the appendix. Rogozov nearly fainted several times during the procedure, but somehow managed to maintain consciousness long enough to complete the operation. He removed the infected appendix, cleaned the surgical site, and sutured the incision closed. The entire procedure took nearly 2 hours, during which he had pushed his body and mind beyond what most people would consider possible. His assistants had watched in amazement as their colleague performed what seemed like a miracle of determination and medical skill. The recovery process was as dangerous as the surgery itself. Rogozov administered antibiotics to prevent infection and monitored his vital signs for complications. He remained bedridden for several days, gradually regaining strength as his body healed from both the appendicitis and the surgical trauma. Within 2 weeks, he had recovered sufficiently to resume his duties as the station's medical officer. Rogozov's self-appendectomy became one of medicine's most extraordinary achievements, demonstrating what human determination could accomplish when facing impossible odds. But while his story involved the fate of a single individual fighting for survival, history also records tragedies where entire communities faced losses that defied explanation and left wounds that never healed. The children who never came home. In the medieval town of Hamelin, Germany, something far more devastating was about to unfold. The year was 1284, and what happened next would become one of history's most enduring mysteries. According to various historical accounts and folklore that developed around these events, a large number of children disappeared from the town in circumstances that have never been fully explained. The story that emerged from these events tells of children leaving Hamelin together, following a stranger who had come to the town from outside. Different versions of the tale provide varying details, but the core elements remain consistent across multiple sources. The children departed their homes and families, walking away from everything they had known, and were never seen again. No trace of them was ever found. No survivors ever returned to explain what had happened. The disappearance has generated numerous theories over the centuries, each attempting to provide a rational explanation for what became known as the Pied Piper legend. One prominent theory connects these events to the Children's Crusade of 1212, a documented historical movement where thousands of young people set out for the Holy Land, believing they could succeed where adult crusaders had failed. This theory suggests that the children of Hamelin were recruited or inspired to join this religious movement, ultimately dying en route to their destination or perishing in the harsh conditions they encountered. Religious fervor was a powerful force in medieval Europe, capable of inspiring people to undertake dangerous journeys with little chance of survival. If a charismatic religious figure had visited Hamelin and convinced the children that God was calling them to serve in the Holy Land, they might have willingly followed him to their deaths. The Children's Crusade offers a plausible framework for understanding how so many young people could be convinced to abandon their families simultaneously. Another theory proposes that the children succumbed to dancing plague or mass hysteria, documented phenomena that affected medieval European communities. These psychological epidemics could cause large groups of people to engage in compulsive behaviors that led them away from their homes and families. If the Hamelin children had been seized by such collective madness, they might have wandered into the wilderness in a trance-like state, ultimately dying from exposure or starvation. The dancing plague explanation connects the Hamelin disappearance to other documented cases of mass psychological breakdown in medieval Europe. These events demonstrate how entire communities could be affected by collective mental disturbances that cause people to behave in ways that defied rational explanation. The children might have fallen victim to the same kind of psychological contagion that caused people in other towns to dance themselves to death. The darkest theory suggests that the children were victims of human trafficking or mass abduction. Medieval Europe was not immune to criminal enterprises that involved kidnapping people for slavery or forced labor. The children might have been lured away by criminals who transported them to distant lands where they were sold into bondage. This theory would explain why no trace of the children was ever found in the Hamelin area and why no survivors ever returned home. Human trafficking was a reality in medieval times, with criminals operating networks that moved people across great distances for profit. Children were particularly vulnerable to such schemes because they could be more easily controlled and manipulated than adults. If the Hamelin children had been captured by such criminals, their families would never have learned what became of them. Multiple versions of the story describe someone from outside Hamelin who had the ability to influence the children to follow him. This figure appears consistently across different accounts, suggesting that his role was considered significant by those who preserved these stories. The consistency of this detail across various sources lends some credibility to the idea that an outsider was responsible for leading the children away. The psychological impact on Hamelin appears to have been devastating and long-lasting. Various accounts describe the town implementing restrictions on music and dancing in areas associated with the children's disappearance, revealing the depth of the community's trauma. These measures were not merely symbolic gestures, but practical attempts to prevent any repetition of the events that had destroyed so many families. Imagine the horror experienced by parents who watched their children walk away and never return. Families lost their sons and daughters in a single day, with no explanation and no closure. The grief must have been overwhelming, made worse by the complete absence of any information about what had happened to the missing children. Parents would have spent years wondering if their children were still alive somewhere, suffering in captivity or struggling to survive in foreign lands. The town's response to this tragedy reveals how communities attempt to cope with incomprehensible loss. The restrictions on music and dancing represented an effort to control forces that the townspeople believed had contributed to their children's disappearance. Whether they blamed supernatural influences, psychological contagion, or criminal activity, they were determined to prevent anything similar from happening again. The enduring mystery surrounding the Hamelin children demonstrates how some historical events resist explanation despite centuries of investigation and speculation. Young lives simply vanished from the historical record, leaving behind only the grief of their families and the desperate attempts of later generations to understand what had happened to them. The story has survived precisely because it captures something fundamental about human vulnerability and the fragility of the communities we build to protect ourselves. What makes this tale particularly haunting is how it reveals the thin boundary between the safety we assume and the chaos that can suddenly consume entire communities. The children of Hamelin lived in what they believed was a secure world, surrounded by family and familiar surroundings, until something disrupted that security forever. Conclusion: these documented tragedies forced re-evaluations of fundamental institutions. Law enforcement methods evolved after cases like Holmes's murder castle exposed investigative limitations. Medical understanding advanced through confronting diseases like Renaissance syphilis. Military tactics changed after events like the attack of the dead men revealed the unpredictable nature of chemical warfare. History's horrors often blend real suffering with sensational storytelling. We should approach dramatic accounts with healthy skepticism while honoring the genuine victims whose lives were destroyed by these events. The truth remains sobering enough without embellishment. These stories show how human choices, technology, and misfortune combine to produce horrors we can now study and learn from. Which of these events unsettled you most and why? Share your thoughts in the comments below and subscribe if you appreciate careful, well-researched histories of the macabre.